One of the things I love about doing my pendants is basing it on the concept of building a house. We build the walls, we put the roof on, and the backs and fronts. In this lesson, we're going to start with building our wall, and we'll begin doing that by sizing up the stone and talk about stones a little bit. We'll fully work through weaving that bezel, and then we'll secure it and shape it around the stone, ready for the next step. Let's take a few moments and look at some of the stones I have here so that we can talk about which ones you want to pick for this project and some things to think about. I prefer my stone sizes to be 30 to 40 millimeters across, either direction. If they get too small, then it requires different sizes of wire. So the 30 to 40 millimeters and even a little bigger will work very well. This here is a glass cabochon that I have, and you may be able to see there's a small hole there. So if you do have a pendant that has a drilled hole at the top, that's perfectly fine too, because a lot of our adornments are going to cover that, and sometimes you can even use that to your advantage. These stones here, one of which I'll be doing in class, has a sharp bend at the bottom. So as we wrap the bezel wall around that, I'll show you how to deal with that bend. Awkward shapes can be used too, like this ammonite. I can show you how to deal with that shape. And this labradorite, this one has a blue flash to it. So you want to look at your stones depending what color they are and see which way you want them to lie. I might want to wrap him up like that. It depends the best way I'm going to get the blue flash. The other thing to keep in mind with your stones is what is called Mohs hardness. That is the hardness or softness scale that all stones are rated by. And soft stones, sometimes, because this is a very tight, secure wrapping, sometimes they can be under pressure. I've only ever had two stones that have broken on me. One was a prehnite and one was chrysocolla. So I tend to avoid pure chrysocolla as it crumbled like talc in my hand whenever I was wrapping it. So you don't want to run into that. If you look up the Mohs scale, it goes from 0 to 10, and anything under 3 or below can be a little bit dicey to work with, and just be aware that when you're tightening it down, you have to be a little bit more careful. So I'm going to move the stones we're not using out of my way. And using this stone, we're going to measure it so we know how much wire to cut, and I do that with painter's tape. So I have some already cut off of the painter's tape roll. I cut it in half so you get longer strips, and I also cut some extra strips so I have them on the side of the table that we can use them to secure the bezel at the end of wrapping it. So we're going to take the painter's tape and we're going to put it right up at the top of what we have determined to be the top of our pendant, and you just wrap it around and then tear it right off. So that tape, essentially, we don't have to take out a tape measure and be precise and measure the stone. We now know exactly the length that we need for the bezel to weave it. And I generally take that off and put it right in front of me. That way, as we're weaving, we can reference it and hold our weaving up against this and see where we're at as far as length and how much further we need to go. And now we're ready to cut our base wires. We're going to start with 16 gauge first. That's the thicker of the two base wires. I have these cut already. And I lay them up. I center the painter's tape that we measured the stone with in the center where the weaving will be, so I can see on either side. I leave about 3 inches extra. This is the extra wire will become our bail. So this is our 16 gauge, which is the thicker one. And when I cut them, you use your flush cutters to cut them off your spool, and you always do your flush side facing the wire you're going to keep. If you cut with the other side, you get a sharp corner, and then you'll be poking your fingers on that when you're trying to weave. So this piece both has the flush cut side. I'm going to bring in my 18 gauge wire too, and when I cut that, I just line that up against the first wire lengthwise and cut it to the same length. And this end has one of those sharp divots I was talking about, so we'll trim him off right now. And the divoted side of the flush cutters, I call that like the garbage can. So you can catch that end there. You know that that's the side you're throwing away, and just get rid of it. So now they're both flush cut. And we'll be weaving with our 26 gauge, which is our thinner wire. I weave from the spool for this part, which is nice. It's economical because you don't have a lot of wire waste. You can work directly from the spool. And I use my painter's tape, kind of like a knitting bowl. As we need more wire, we can pull away. If your spool is smaller, you can probably find a jar or a lid or something at home that you can position that in. So we're going to take our 16 gauge wire first, the thicker of the two, and hold it like this, leaving about a half an inch or an inch of our tip is where we're going to do most of our work at. I take the weaving wire, and one of my golden rules is to always leave about 6 inches as a tail, because you may be able to use it later in the designing at other steps, and it's already there for you rather than adding a whole new wire in. It's going to go completely perpendicular to the base wire, and we're going to coil it around 2 or 3 times just to secure it to our base wire. And I always end headed away from me. We'll bring in our 18 gauge wire, the second base wire, and we're going to lay that directly on top, holding it good and secure underneath our thumb. But now our distance at this point is going to have to match the stone. The stones are usually cut in similar depths, but sometimes you have a real thick one or a real thin one. So we're going to position him just like that to see the distance that we need for this wall. And then we're going to weave towards us twice and go under the first wire and away and under that second wire. And I'm going to do this a couple times so I can secure these, because right now both those base wires are kind of wonky and they want to move around. And again, you'll see me use my curved pliers here a lot for shuttling that weaving over towards my thumb. That helps to wire harden it and keep it tight. And then I use them to just adjust the tips. Until you get a lot of weaving build up on here, those tips are going to move around, especially when it's your first work and you're a little bit more tense. You're going to tend to pull on the wire more, and you're going to start to pull them in towards each other. So just be mindful of that. You can do these adjusting movements anytime you need, as often as you need to keep your weave straight. So we'll go around twice towards us and twice away. And then shuttle to the left, and just make sure your spacing's good. And as you're working, one of the things that I found that I was doing in the beginning is I needed to make sure that the wire is landing perpendicular when I'm weaving. You have to move it to the right to get it under those wires, so sometimes you tend to slant that direction. Your tension should be real loose on the weaving wire, and then land it down so it's completely up and down. When you're doing that, you may overcompensate and you may start to weave too much to the left and go on top of your previous weaving. And I'll do that here so I can show you how we get out of that problem. So if you overlap, I'm going to get this pointer and show you right here where I've kind of overlapped my other weaving. And you might not notice it right away, but as you progress, this weave is really nice because it has a repeating pattern. So it creates this kind of illusion, and one wire that's out of place will show up pretty clearly here the further that you go. You can unweave this and take it out. It's going to be lumpy and bumpy, but you don't have to really stress out about straightening it out. Just unweave it back to the point where you overlapped, and then go back to weaving, and just that little bit of tension on the wire will lay it down again the way it should be. And I'll shuttle that. Now we've done the weaving really slow. I'm going to weave for just a moment or two at my normal speed. You can see how as you get more skilled at this, you're going to be able to fly on autopilot and weave up this bezel. The more weave that we have here, the stronger those base wires are holding together. They're not moving as much. And as the weave grows, we're going to keep shuttling it to the left, and it will be under our thumb here. The best way to move it is to pull your base wires out once you're getting too close to the tip and you don't have a lot of space to work on. And I'm just going to weave here for a couple minutes, and you can work along with me as you get your bezel done. I think we're at a spot now where we've woven as much as we need for our bezel. To look at it, you can see the nice repeating pattern that we have. And I have the weaving all tight and pressed together. We did that as we were weaving along. If you're working with sterling, sterling has that spring back and it wants to move away. So that's another reason that we're pressing it together to keep it tight. So as you're weaving, you would be putting it against the painter's tape that we measured and make sure that you have enough. And again, with the silver, you're going to want to push it and compress it to make sure that you haven't missed anything. So we look like we're good here. And we're going to center the weaving now on to the middle of the wire. And the easiest way to do that is to use your curved nose pliers and pull these base wires out. With the silver, it's a little easier because, again, it has that spring back, except sometimes for me because I've been weaving so long and I get it tighter. And we'll get it to the middle. And as you were weaving this and comparing it to the painter's tape along the way to make sure what length you were getting, you also can use your stone again and pick that up and make sure that you're staying pretty on track with your distance between your two base wires. So I have this one centered now at the middle of the base wires with it's about equal amounts on either side. Those will be, when I form this and wrap the bezel wall around the stone, those will be coming up at the top, and we'll continue on to make our bail and some of the other pieces we need for further lessons. I have a sample that I brought that I wove in copper because sometimes copper is a little harder to center on the base wires and move down. Copper grabs on copper a lot tighter than the sterling silver does. So I want to show you how to adjust this if you find yourself with some tight weaving. You can first try like you normally do with pulling with the curved nose pliers to pull this copper wire out. But if it's real rigid, sometimes I hold it up to my body and I wiggle these base wires and give them some motion, and that'll bring them out. You can see that's already sliding really nicely. But if it's super tight and you still can't get them to move, come down here to the bottom of your weaving and you can separate this and move this. By separating it, it seems to give it more space and mobility, and you can just slowly scooch it down to the center where you need it to be. It won't change the weave at all. Now, my only caution, if you have to do this because your weaving is tight, is you're going to want to compress it all together again. You can see how we have some spaces there. If your hands are on either end of this weave and you just press in, the center of your base wires is going to collapse and bend on you like that. So you want to avoid doing that. Start at the bottom of your weave again, just like we would have shuttled it as we were weaving it, and compress it to the left. And copper is soft enough, again, since we didn't do any hardening to the wire before we started working with it, that you can just unbend any bends or snaps like that, and they'll be okay. So I'm going to put that, get our copper out of the way. Now we're ready to shape this around our stone. Look at your weaving for a moment. We started with the 16 gauge wire first, so that's on the bottom. The 16 gauge is going to be our bail, so we want to make sure that that stays on the bottom as we shape it around our stone. Before we shape it, we're going to put an angle in it, and that's beginning to build on the next lesson for the bail. So if you take your curved nose pliers again, and the bottom wire here is our 16 gauge, we're going to grasp that and just make one quick, like 45-degree bend outwards. This part then is going to go to the top of your stone on the left-hand side, like that. And then we're going to take this bezel and we're going to wrap it around the stone and back up the other side. I'll show you how to fix it if we don't have enough weaving. Sometimes, even though you measured the stone with the tape, just the shape of it's kind of weird and you end up a little short or a little long, so we'll cover that. But I'm gonna wrap this around. It's easier if I pick it up for just a second to get the first bend. And then you can use if you hold it with your left hand, and you can secure it with grab it with your right thumb. And up here we have our front 18 gauge wire and the other front 18 gauge wire. I usually put my right behind my left because I'm right-handed, and I'm going to be wrapping that around the bale in a later lesson. One of the other things I want to show you is this stone has a pointy bottom. Sometimes the wire doesn't want to give fully to that point and it's loose. So in order to fix that, you overbend it and then straighten it back out. I'll put the stone down. I'm going to take these curved nose pliers, and right where the bend is, I'm going to really bend that in tight, and then I'm going to bring it back out again. And it creates a sharper bend that will hold the point of that stone. You can see it's really sitting in there nicely now in that bezel. And if it turns out that you did not weave enough at this point, all you have to do is take that bend out. I'm going to unbend it and simply keep doing your 2x2 weave. You won't be at the tips of the wire, so you'll just have to, it's a little bit harder to lay down that weaving, but you'll be fine just to put down a few rows to get to the point that they meet at the top. And then if you've overwoven and there's too much weaving there, you can just insert your flush cutters at the point where you have too much weaving and just nip it, and then slide that right off. It doesn't matter that you don't have a tail left at that point, that's okay. We're gonna have enough tails on this to do all kinds of designs coming up. So as I hold this here, we need to do the same bend in the 16 gauge wire on the right side now. So I make sure everybody, hold it like that. And I use my flush cutters or the curved nose pliers to kind of compress this down too, real nice and tight before I do the bend. And then I just do a bend out. So we have our wires crossing on the front, the 18 gauge wires, and then we have both of our 16 gauge wires on the back angled out, ready for the next step. We'll be shaping the bale. But we need to secure this in there with the painter's tape so that we don't have to worry about this stone anymore with our further steps. So we'll take some of these painter's tape strips that we have over here, and I just put them flat down right on top. And then we'll lift up the stone and wrap it around. And you can use as much as you need. We're not going to be doing anything with this stone in the front or the back yet. We'll be focused all on the bale. I'm going to just turn it sideways and adjust it a little bit. You can see I'm going to push it on the weave and adjust that angle. I'm going to adjust that angle. I'm going to put one more piece of tape. The last thing we need to do now is just trim our weaving wire and cut it off. And if you ask how long, the answer is always about 6 inches tail we're going to leave. So we'll snip that off. And at this point, this is ready for the next step where we'll be shaping the bale. I'm going to move this piece out of the way now and show you a variation that you can do of this weave. I call this the sawtooth, and it's essentially the same 2x2 figure 8 weave that you've been doing. We just do a break in the weaving on the top wire. This allows you to create a purse string effect that you can pull taut to cover the stone a little differently if it's a strange shape, or you want to have a more slanted look to your bezel. It's drawn in. So you essentially weave it the same way as the other 2x2, but I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then I'll show you here the weaving that I have. You start it exactly the same way as you do your 2x2 weave, but you stop after doing 5 sets, and you can separate the wires a little bit here and count off, your 5 pairs around that upper base wire. So you start the weave the same as you've always done. After 5 sets, when you return to your 16 gauge base wire, you're just going to simply coil around for a count of 10. And then return to your upper wire and do your 5 sets. There's our third one, our fourth, and our fifth. And now that I'm back down to the 16 gauge base wire, I'll go around 10 times. And you can still do your adjustments. You can see though that since there is a break in the weaving here, that you can use your pliers and kind of compress that a little bit that way. It's just going to be a little looser on the top wire since we don't have a complete weaving the whole length of it. And now you have one more additional skill in your arsenal with the sawtooth weave to make your pendants even more individual. And next, we're going to start working on building our bail, which can be the most overlooked piece of a pendant, and yours is going to be fantastic.